everybody for coming too. I see a lot of names I know, and a few that I don't, but really appreciate you all taking the time. And if you have followed Strong Towns at all, if you've seen Chuck give his version of this talk, mine is extremely different, which is kind of the fun thing about co-authoring a book. Was coming to it with different areas of expertise and sort of different I think a different focus on a problem that really is multifaceted and really defies simple cause and effect. So I'm going to give kind of an abbreviated version of the book talk that I give, and try to leave a lot of time for Q&A because I think I'm among people here who I know have some familiarity with Strong Towns, who longtime members of PRN, people who can anticipate some of what I'm going to say, but I hope that I still tie some threads together in a way that is interesting. Let me share my screen here. Start from beginning. Share screen. All right. Are the slides showing? Somebody, yep, Paula, I see a thumbs up. Awesome. Um, when I was working on this book last year, I had just moved back to Minnesota. I lived in Florida for about a decade. And I'd moved back to my hometown and I was reconnecting with old friends and telling them what I've been up to. And one of my friends from high school, I said, we're just hanging out, we're having lunch. And I said, well, I'm working on this book with my boss about the housing crisis. And he kind of furrows his brow and he says, wait, which one? Um, and I was a little bit bemused by that at the time because like you spend enough time in this world of advocates and people who are trying to change certain things and who all share certain assumptions about like, well, of course these are the problems that we face here, but the reality is we do not have sort of a common definition of what the problem is as a society. No one who I've talked to about this work or about this book has ever disagreed that we're in a housing crisis. You ask, random person on the street, they're going to say, yeah, of course we are. Things are messed up. Housing is not good in America right now. People aren't getting what they need out of it. They're not finding a home they can afford. They're not finding a home that suits their needs in a place that serves their life well. Everybody agrees with that. Um, Newsweek ran an article in the middle of 2023, right around the time that the Case-Shiller index of home prices hit its all-time peak. And they surveyed people and they asked, what direction do housing prices need to go in your community? And 43% said they'd like to see housing prices go up, and 41% said they'd like to see them go down. The title of this article was Housing Market Crash Fears Rise Among Americans. Um, we actually have a whole lot of incoherence in just sort of mainstream conventional wisdom about what we want out of housing. And part of the problem is everybody agrees on some level that like housing affordability is good, that housing is unaffordable for too many people. But do you want the value of your own house to fall if you're a homeowner? Do you want the value of your investment portfolio to fall? What about university endowments, pension funds? Our whole society is leveraged on, to a large extent, the mortgage industry, the housing industry, housing as an investment product. So we have two fundamentally dissonant conversations about housing in our society. The one in which housing is in crisis because there's not enough of it, it's not affordable enough, people can't secure housing. And the one in which we're constantly afraid that housing might be in crisis in the way it was in, say, 2008, when prices were falling so fast that they took the whole economy down with them. We are in a trap. We kind of all know that housing prices need to fall. Too many people cannot afford housing that adequately serves them. But it's also very true that housing prices cannot be allowed to fall significantly or rapidly or in a sustained way, not without doing a whole lot of collateral economic damage. We are in a fundamental contradiction here. And this isn't just a US phenomenon. You can see this contradiction really explicitly articulated all the time once you're looking for it. This is Justin Trudeau in Canada just a couple weeks ago. Real estate needs to be more affordable, but lowering home prices would put retirement plans at risk. Well, How are you going to square that circle? Um, we know housing needs to be more affordable because the household with the median income, 50% of households make more, 50% make less, can only buy approximately 20% of the homes for sale in the US. And in expensive markets, this number plummets 7.6% in metropolitan Seattle. And the median income household, 50% of households can only buy 1.9% of the homes for sale in greater Los Angeles. This is not sustainable. Housing is a giant game of musical chairs. This is like the best metaphor I've ever come across for the housing market. Actually, I see we have at least one person here from the Sightline Institute, and I always make sure to credit Sightline for this. They did a wonderful viral video on this back in 2017 about housing as a cruel game of musical chairs, in which the way you get a chair is not by being the fastest, it's by being the richest. It's by outbidding other people. Um, and if there aren't enough chairs for the number of people playing the game, someone is going to lose that game. It doesn't matter how good the players are, how fast they can run, whatever, or in this case, how much money they have. When you have a shortage, someone is going to lose. The housing crisis is the direst consequences, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, are experienced by sort of the ultimate losers of this game. And we can see that really clearly when we analyze, who are the ultimate losers of the housing market? They're people who literally cannot secure a home. There's been some amazing research in a book published a couple years ago called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, where they looked at the rates of homelessness in cities across the country, cities and counties, and they found that it's not correlated with the rates of drug abuse or addiction. It's not correlated with rates of mental illness. It's not particularly correlated with poverty. What it's correlated with is housing costs. A simple way of putting this maybe is that if you have some dysfunction in your life, if you have a mental illness that's untreated, if you have an addiction problem, and you live in New York City or San Francisco, you are living on the street. You can have the same problems personally. If you're in Mississippi, if you're in West Virginia, you're much more likely to have a roof over your head. So housing shortages ultimately have these dire cascading consequences. For people higher up on the ladder, it means precarity, too much debt, personal sacrifice, the inability to move for a job, the inability to live near family. It means all these things that we can't downplay the importance of. For people of much lesser means, it means being on the street. It means living in your car. It means living in constant fear of eviction. The housing crisis takes a lot of different forms for different people, but um, we still have this. There are huge forces in our society invested in seeing housing prices go up and up and up forever, in seeing housing as a financial product drive the US economy. But something's got to give because too many people are suffering. We have a broken housing paradigm. And if you read the book, what you really see is that it examines all the different facets of this broken paradigm um, in a way that doesn't lend itself to linear causes and effects, because that's not how paradigms work. If we could simply pull a couple policy levers and solve the housing shortage, that would be amazing. We can't do that because systems are really, really stubborn. Systems are inflexible. You pull one lever and then you find that something else is preventing you from pulling it. We have an intertwined system of financial and legal and regulatory and cultural arrangements around how we build and finance and produce housing that kind of all need to shift. We need to develop new paradigms. That is the central theme of escaping the housing trap, that there's not one or two levers we can pull to just build a bunch of homes and get out of this mess. The systems in place won't allow us to do it. Housing prices won't be allowed to fall in a sustained way. The thing about broken paradigms is their brokenness reveals itself over time through tensions that kind of grow and grow until you can't ignore them anymore. Um, but most of the time that you're living under a fundamentally unsustainable paradigm, you don't realize how messed up it is. Talking to PRN members here, I think one of the things about you know, being a parking reformer, being dare I say shoot pilled, if you've kind of gotten into this world, it's because you realized at some point that a whole bunch of things are really messed up. Like that the world we live in is actually really weird. And it's really weird for this set of reasons that are kind of invisible to the average person. But once you start digging, it's like, wait a minute, you mean huge aspects of the urban form of my city are determined by the fact that somewhere along the line we decided that a bowling alley needs seven parking stalls per lane here, but it only needs two per lane. Like all of the, if you've ever seen Tony speak about this stuff, all the absurdities that are underlying a system that produces a set of outcomes in the world. And once you start digging, you discover just like what a multi-headed hydra of messy problems it is. I think digging into the roots of the housing crisis are that way. Um, it's something that you don't get until you start to see it or you start to learn about it, and then you're like, oh my God. So I went on that journey, long ago, kind of in my early adulthood. Um, and it led me to want to study urban planning. It led me to want to work at Strong Towns. I like to talk about that journey because I think a lot of people have a similar one. This is the house that my parents lived in when I was a baby. It was a duplex in St. Paul, Minnesota, and my aunt and my mom bought it together. As young adults, it was the way that they could afford to buy a home. And so my parents lived upstairs and they got a lot of free childcare and cheap rent. And like it was just a perfect arrangement. And when we kind of outgrew that arrangement, we moved to another house in the same neighborhood. My aunt's best friend moved in as her upstairs tenant and was essentially honorary family. Like I saw this woman so much throughout my childhood. I thought of her like family. We called her the upstairs Judy. Um, and they had this wonderful, I mean, lifelong, just perfect friendship, this roommate situation that was, they could afford housing, they could have a situation that was really, really socially rewarding. Like it was a perfect arrangement. And I don't think any of the neighbors would have disagreed with that. I think they all thought, yeah, this is great. We got these people in our neighborhood. They found this way to secure housing for themselves that checks a lot of great boxes. This is awesome. That house would have been illegal to build in St. Paul at the time that I was living in it. And I didn't know this as a kid. And I bet that almost none of the neighbors knew that. I bet like nobody would have thought about it. Unless you were a housing developer, unless you wanted to go and build a duplex, and you would have been told very clearly by the planning department, nope, you can't do that. This house was legally non-conforming. Um, I love that phrase. It's a bit of planner ease, legally non-conforming. It's like here's some like 1950s sociologist talking about socially deviant habits. It's just so clinical. Um, Nothing about our lifestyle was non-conforming or objectionable. How do we get like why? Why is it like that? In my 20s, I lived in two different backyard apartments, what a city planner would call an accessory dwelling unit in Sarasota, Florida. My wife and I rented these little backyard units. And for us, it was like a small place that was perfect for where we were at in our lives. It was a way to live in a walkable neighborhood that we otherwise couldn't remotely have afforded to buy in. We saved a bunch of money by only having to own one car because we could walk to so much of what we needed. It was the perfect arrangement for us. Similar houses, small houses, these little backyard cottages are a perfect arrangement for example, a retiree who wants to downsize. Um, they were a feature of this older neighborhood in Sarasota built in the 1920s and 30s. They were around. I don't think anybody ever thought about them as being objectionable. Certainly, we met our neighbors. We liked our neighbors. Um, our landlord was an older woman who had inherited the house and really needed a source of cash flow. And it was that for her. Like this was a great arrangement that was improvised in a way that it met a bunch of different people's needs. It was illegal. It was a grandfathered in arrangement that you could not replicate under the zoning code. Um, this is a map of Somerville, Massachusetts, produced in 2015 by the planning department. Somerville set out to figure out how many of the existing residential lots in Somerville were actually conforming with the city's own rules. In a city of 80,000 people, the answer was 22. There were 22 residential properties in Somerville that would have been illegal to rebuild if they burned down. Um, no one thinks anything is wrong with Somerville, Massachusetts. The median home price in Somerville, Massachusetts is about $1 million. It is a successful place. It's thought of as a charming, desirable place. It checks all the boxes that are kind of in vogue today. It's walkable, sense of character, local businesses. Everybody loves Somerville. Why? And the answer is systems that have kind of grown out of our control, a paradigm that arose for a set of understandable reasons and is now kind of this big thorny mess that we have to figure out how to unwind. To understand the origins of this system, because I think it's important to understand how we got here and that people actually made some sympathetic decisions to get us here. Um, Most housing at the turn of the 20th century was not, the stately old Victorians, the quaint houses that everyone admires today. Most housing was pretty low quality. It was like these wooden shacks in St. Paul at the time. This was an immigrant neighborhood called Swede Hollow. People built what they could with what they had, which often wasn't much. And mostly people obtained housing in kind of ad hoc, improvised ways in a very low regulation environment. Um, all of the great American cities started at one point as like rows of shacks somewhere on a frontier. People didn't have a bunch of debt. There weren't big, well-capitalized developers building this stuff. It was people working with the resources they had. And over time, cities built that way by many, many hands could scale up incredibly rapidly, as Cincinnati did in the 1840s, or Chicago in the late 19th century. Cities that were growing incredibly, incredibly fast at speeds that like nowhere comes close to today, were able to meet the housing demand that they faced as these like rapidly growing chaotic places through many, many hands, through constant flux, through a really low bar to entry to build housing. And a lot of that housing started out really low quality, but neighborhoods would improve themselves over time. And you would tend to see a pattern where the center of town was the wealthiest and the fastest growing part of a community. You'd get the biggest buildings there, you'd get the most concentrated wealth. When you move to the edges of town, the practical barriers were low, the housing cost was low, the quality was low. But over time, you would see this sort of steady churn and this steady improvement. This was a chaotic process, and we shouldn't romanticize the conditions. Like, there wasn't a lot of homelessness in the modern sense in this era. People secured housing, but a lot of it was really miserably low quality. Um, this is one of the famous photographs by Jacob Riis from How the Other Half Lives. Um, what you had in the early 20th century is society became wealthier. Simultaneously, you had a reformist movement to deal with these problems of housing quality that became like really intimately wrapped up with sort of moralistic concerns about how should people live. Lawrence Vaylor, one of the key early housing reformers, tenement reformers, one of the architects of modern zoning, used phrases all the time like the lodger evil to refer to people, usually unmarried young men, renting a room in someone else's home. What today we just call a subletter. There was this sort of systematic campaign to, on the one hand, deal with some very real health and safety issues, but on the other hand, systematize and regularize and sort of eliminate ad hoc living arrangements that were seen by generally well-meaning reformers as morally unsuitable. Um, this is a key part of the story of the rise of modern zoning. Um, I don't think you can separate neatly the public health motives, the concerns about housing quality, about fire risk, when the same people held concerns that today we would easily recognize as bigoted, as racist, as xenophobic, as classist, whatever label you want to put on it. Um, but we built these institutions. Um, and what we did was we really systematically started to outlaw a lot of the strategies that people had used to afford housing. The biggest reason that Somerville is now the illegal city of Somerville is that something like these triple deckers, which are sort of a ubiquitous housing type in New England, um, these were like the most small d democratic thing you could do. They weren't complicated to build. If you had some basic carpentry skills, you could figure out how to build one of these houses. So immigrants would build them, and then they would live in one unit. They'd put up relatives in the second unit. They'd have a rent-paying tenant in the third. Mill owners, factory owners would build them for their workforce. It was a really ad hoc, adaptive thing that anybody could do. Um, but triple deckers were almost completely outlawed in New England by 1930, largely due to this notion of we're kind of offended by the chaos. We're offended by the ad hoc aspect of it. We're worried about health and safety, but also maybe like corrupting moral influences. You see this over and over again in the rhetoric. We systematically started to crowd out all of the sort of adaptive emergent ways that people manage to afford shelter. At the same time, we had a financial revolution in housing. Prior to the Great Depression, you couldn't get anything like a modern mortgage product. You were generally borrowing with a 50% down payment, and an interest only loan where you just pay interest, you wouldn't pay down the principal for a very short term. And then you would either have to pay off the rest of the home's value or you would refinance that loan. Um, so home ownership was not this kind of mass streamlined middle class product that it is today. When the Great Depression happens, what happens is you have a downward spiral of huge numbers of people losing their housing. You go to refinance your home's value has fallen. Now you can only borrow 50% of that new value. In order to refinance, you need to come up with the difference. A lot of people couldn't. And so you had a massive spiral of foreclosures, of people losing their homes, which then pumps more supply into a declining market. The federal government stepped in to arrest this by essentially inventing the modern mortgage market. As part of the New Deal, FDR created, or the administration created the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. And what the FHA did was they would insure banks against mortgage default. They would insure mortgages that met certain criteria, so the banks would start lending again. And they created this standardized product. You could now get a 20 or a 30-year mortgage with a standard monthly payment, and a low down payment to begin with. Something that like banks would not do this. Banks are not going to lend a product like this left to their own devices, not without the federal government backstopping it, because it's inherently really, really risky to lend at such low rates over such a long period. Um, I have never given this talk in 30 minutes, and I'm going to pick up the pace and probably skip some of the slides here because I'm realizing I am 20 minutes in. Um, Normally, I give a longer version of this, but I do want to make sure that we have time for some discussion, some Q&A. This financial experiment ends up giving rocket fuel to a brand new pattern of development that already kind of had its roots in the advent of zoning, the advent of a much more systematized form of control over the form of communities. What happened now was you had this absolute explosion of mass-produced housing monocultures. And you had a huge amount of federal intervention that went into making them broadly affordable to a growing post-war middle class. This experiment, for a generation, produced a really, really sustained economic boom, and it probably saved us from falling back into depression after World War II, because we have all this excess industrial capacity, this excess capacity in the economy. We got to put it to use somewhere. We put it to use building the suburbs. Now we've created this economic engine where single-family home purchases are the fundamental driver. And that engine has to keep going. And you can see already in that first generation that the way it's going to keep going is through private debt, essentially pulling future resources into present day spending. You buy a house, you buy a brand new house, you're employing a bunch of people to build that house, you're employing a bunch of people in the lending industry to facilitate that transaction. This becomes a really, really powerful economic engine, but one that we have to prime kind of more and more aggressively in order to keep it going. And you start to see that happen. What you start to see is every time home prices, this is the Case-Shiller index of home prices, you start looking after 1970, every time home prices threaten to fall in a really sustained way, and the book traces this history in much more detail than I'm going to go into, the government steps in and does something to juice the mortgage market just a little bit more. We change the rules around what kind of loans can be bought up and securitized and repackaged. We changed the rules about what kind of loans can be held on the books of entities like Fannie Mae. Um, this induces banks to do more lending because the thing about mortgage loans, the thing about this particular standardized product is banks love it because they always have a buyer for it. They don't have to hold it on their books. Um, if you don't have to hold the loan on your books, if you can take it and sell it off to a third party entity, you can go ahead and make more loans. It's great. Um, so there are all these financial inducements that we can do to make more mortgage lending possible, to make lower down payments possible, to lend to people with worse credit histories. And it's sort of this desperate race to just keep the engine going until we all know the history of what happened in the subprime mortgage crisis. Um, you have, over the course of a few years, there's a long history here and there's kind of a complex history, but um, these kind of zealous expectations, this desperate need to not be the one holding the bag. You see lenders engaging in some cases, overt financial fraud, but also just more and more kind of arcane repackaging of secondary mortgage derivatives, of financial instruments that are fundamentally backstopped by you or me buying a house, in ways that hide the risk. And we kind of know what happened. Everybody here was here for the fallout of that. Um, One of the consequences of the 2008 crash is that the production of new housing, which had already been kind of lagging since the 1970s, fell off an absolute cliff. There were a few years where nobody's building anything. Skilled workers leave the trades, a problem that we're still dealing with the hangover of this. There are still massive labor shortages in all the different skilled trades that go into building a house. Um, Finance completely dries up for a few crucial years. At the same time as this catastrophic fall off in housing production occurs, you also have the millennials, the largest generation since the baby boomers, reaching home buying age. And you have tightened mortgage lending standards, you have a foreclosure wave, you have a bunch of people pushed into renting who in a previous era might have bought a house. So you have rapidly escalating demand, especially for rental housing, at the same time as supply has absolutely cratered. That is where we find ourselves today. Housing prices have, if you went back, it's hard to even imagine today because there's sort of this common understanding that we're at record housing unaffordability and that that's the crisis we face. If you went back to 2010, 2011, all of the discussion in policy circles and financial circles was about how do we get a housing recovery? We need prices to recover. Well, how do you recover to a bubble? We have surpassed the previous highs um, of the pre-2008 peak. What are we recovering to? Something has to give. Um, there is a popular narrative here that what we really have is a shortage of affordable housing. We don't have a shortage of housing out there. Um, that is not true, and there's a lot of really clear documentation, attempts to quantify exactly how much we have underbuilt. I do want to address this narrative because what you'll see a lot of organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which put out this chart, cite these statistics that look at a glance as though, yeah, there is pretty much enough housing out there for people who make median or above income. And, the shortage is almost entirely of very, very low income housing. What we really need to do, this narrative goes, is just build a bunch of subsidized low income affordable housing. Um, that approach is never, ever going to scale to the size of the problem. This is why. Over the decade of the 2010s, Los Angeles, one of the most unaffordable cities on the continent, lost 111,000 homes where the rent or the price was affordable for low income households. Almost all of those homes were lost, not like to demolition, not to vacancy, not to anything like that. They were lost to simply the rent going up. The rent went up to the point where that home is no longer affordable. And over the same period, about 13,000 new homes affordable to such households were built. This is a massive gap, and we are never going to close this gap through any politically conceivable amount of subsidy. Not well, an overall shortage continues to push rents up in the market as a whole. I'm going to skip some slides. We need a building boom. We need a lot more houses in a lot of places. Um, and the question is, how are we going to get that boom? I think there are three basic elements. I talked about the broken paradigm as being a financial paradigm, a regulatory paradigm, and a cultural paradigm. We need to fix the regulations that hamstring housing production. We need to grow a new culture of incremental development, of thickening up existing neighborhoods, of building a whole lot of relatively small, relatively inexpensive infill units. And we need to create financial tools that make it possible to do that at scale. That's how we're going to close this gap. In terms of code reform, we need to address the zoning lockdown that most parts of most of our cities are under. Even major cities, places that predate modern suburban style zoning, in North America typically have 70 to 90% of their land reserved for only one type of housing, detached single family homes. You go out to the suburbs, you see even greater percentages than this. Um, think about what that pink means. If you have a neighborhood that is built out with single family homes and there are no vacant lots, that neighborhood legally cannot grow. You cannot add net housing. You can maybe do a one-to-one replacement or a renovation of an existing home. No matter how much demand there is to live in that place, no matter how great the amenities are, the businesses, the parks, the schools, no matter how many people want to live in that place cannot legally grow. There is no feedback mechanism. People in like the Yes in My Backyard movement will get flack sometimes for saying these sort of platitudinal, well, that's not a word, whatever. Platitudinous, I'm just gonna make it a word, things like legalize housing. And people will roll their eyes and say, what do you mean it's not illegal to build housing? This is what I was talking about not realizing how weird the status quo is until you start to see it. Housing is illegal in most places. In most neighborhoods in North America, adding housing is illegal. This is the zoned capacity of Los Angeles. You can see from 1960 to 1990, there was this wave of citizen-led, like mostly neighborhood-led downzonings to the point where Los Angeles almost can't grow. It is no surprise that Los Angeles is one of the most expensive cities in the country. There are very few places that you can actually build new homes. You can look at maps over time. From 1940 to 1960, you can see the dominant type of new housing built in metropolitan Los Angeles. The dark blue, which is barely present on this map, represents neighborhoods where there was almost no construction occurring. And we can see what happens over time, 1980, 2000, 2016. Almost all of Metro Los Angeles slowly turns dark blue. In other words, these are neighborhoods where there is effectively no new construction. We only allow new housing to be built in really select forms and in really select places in tiny little pockets of our cities. You ever have a pot that's vigorously boiling and you crack the edge just a little bit, you only allow that steam to escape from one little corner, you get a violent whoosh of steam. We need to lift the lid off everywhere. We need to allow at least some viable next increment of housing in every neighborhood. Otherwise, what we're doing, if we funnel new housing to only a handful of places, we're almost guaranteeing that what is built will be extremely expensive. And we're almost guaranteeing disruption of those neighborhoods, gentrification, displacement, the loss of community fabric. We need to legalize housing broadly. I'm going to skip these slides. This used to be the case. You used to have churn, you used to have redevelopment, even in places that were quote unquote built out. We need to make that legal again. I know I'm a little bit over time here, but I love this anecdote too much to not share it. I was in a meeting a couple years ago, just a casual meeting in Sarasota where I was living at the time. I'd been brought in because the city staff had a proposal they were floating to the elected commissioners to allow missing middle housing in a couple of the core neighborhoods near downtown. Missing middle is a term for anyone here who doesn't know that refers to anything, multifamily. So not just a single family home, but up through a small scale apartment building, maybe 2 through 20 units on a lot. And they were going to allow 2 through 4. They were going to allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes in just a couple neighborhoods. And they knew that I wrote about housing for a living and they wanted my opinion. So I sat in this room with a city council member and a staffer and presidents of a few neighborhood associations. All people in their 60s and 70s. It's Florida, it's a retirement kind of community. And the gist of the conversation, it was led by the city councilor who said, I think, I like this idea. I can see the value in this. I just think it needs to be tightly regulated. And she starts running through this litany of what ifs. What if speculators buy these houses? What if they turn them into Airbnbs? What if the tenants are noisy? What if grand old trees are cut down in order to build these houses? What if they're not affordable enough? What if, we're saying we want to do this because we need housing for our downtown workforce? Well, what if the people who live in these houses aren't part of our downtown workforce? Then we're not achieving our goal. Maybe we should have a covenant in the deed that says that you have to show proof of employment in downtown Sarasota to rent a unit in one of these houses. Like, I kid you not, that was floated in this discussion. It was all what if, what if, what if. And then the conversation kind of took a break. Everyone's just sort of shooting the breeze. And it turns out that several of the older people in this room grew up in Massachusetts. And one of them says, oh, yeah, I lived in Fall River as a kid. On this wonderful street where we had a little restaurant on the corner. It was all triple deckers. We had a tenant who lived upstairs in our building. And the city council member who was leading this discussion was also from Massachusetts. And her family had owned a triple decker, and it had been their ticket to the middle class. They had owned it. They had a rent paying tenant. That was how they paid their mortgage. Nobody had anything negative to say about this historic pattern. Oh, it was so charming, such beautiful neighborhoods. Yeah, I miss it up there. Anyway, back to business. I can really see us going for this missing middle housing thing, but it needs to be tightly regulated. Uh, I did my best to point out the dissonance to them, but there is a real cultural hangup we have about uncertainty. And the reality is the paradigm that used to build abundant housing allowed for a good deal of uncertainty. Your neighbors were allowed to build things. You might not like everything that your neighbors could build. We fundamentally do need to get back to that and sweep obstacles out of the way. It should be simple to build something that is an incremental evolution on what's already there. You should be able to go into City Hall at 9 a.m. with a completed application for a permit to build and walk out at noon with that permit. No public hearing, no discretionary review. If you've met the requirements and it's allowed by the zoning, you're good. Go start building that afternoon. The number one regulatory requirement, other than single family zoning itself, the number one that we have to get out of the way, this should come as no surprise to this crowd that I'm saying this. But when you talk to people who do infill development in cities, people who build missing middle housing, they will say very bluntly, if you don't get rid of your parking mandates, you're not serious. We can't do anything until you get rid of that. The geometry is just so prohibitive. The economics of the project are completely prohibitive. And where we've done this, we do see Minneapolis is one of the big success stories here. Eliminated parking mandates in 2018. New buildings are going up with less parking, and new buildings are being built that would have been illegal. The majority of new housing units built in Minneapolis since then would have been illegal under the prior code. There's a whole lot I could talk about with code reform that I'm going to gloss over a little bit, but we need to improve what folks in the incremental development community call the return on brain damage, which is all of the piling up and interlocking convoluted obstacles that can kill an otherwise viable project. Think about it as a door with a whole bunch of deadbolts. It's not just a matter of, well, we upzoned, we're done. Well, we got rid of the parking mandates, we're done. There are a lot of obstacles that stand in the way of not just new housing, but new housing being viable at scale quickly. And once you clear them all away, you see amazing things happen. In California, the production of backyard cottages, accessory dwelling units, has exploded exponentially since a state law in 2017 wiped away most of the local obstacles to their construction, including parking mandates, including rules about utility hookups, about setbacks. Absolute astounding exponential growth. The exponential growth is what we need. You are not going to get that from big corporate developers doing the same product that they already kind of are optimized for doing. They're not going to double their production. What we need to do is we need to bring people off the sidelines and we need to bring land off the sidelines. And what I mean by bringing land off the sidelines is a lot of the housing we need is going to come in the backyards of existing homes. It's going to be carved out efficiency apartments from spare bedrooms in existing homes. That doesn't mean we're not going to have big new apartment buildings. We're not going to have new towers that we don't need that stuff. But where is most of the available land to build? And what are the forms of housing that we're not doing right now that we can get off the sidelines? And how can we make it easy? How can we make it so you can take a single family house, build a cottage in the backyard, carve it into a separate lot and sell it off to an owner? So now somebody will do this who doesn't want to be a landlord. How can we offer pre-approved house designs so you don't have to hire an architect? You don't have to go through a public hearing. If you're building something that the city has already pre-approved, you get your permit, you get your general contractor lined up, you get to work. I'm going to skip building code reform. I'm going to try to wrap up here. I talk about this as unleashing a swarm of small developers. We need 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more people doing small scale incremental infill development in our cities. That's where we're going to actually have a paradigm shift in housing production. And that's what used to be the norm. Chicago grew from 30,000 people in 1850 to 1 million people by 1890, overwhelmingly through semi-amateur, small-scale incremental developers. Anybody can do this if they have access to a network of people who can teach them the ropes, who can teach them how to get the financing, teach them how to get through the zoning code, get permission, teach them how to find a contractor. If you actually want to grow the ranks of people doing this, you need to have an ecosystem that people can plug into. We can't rely on lone heroes who are really, really motivated to build homes in their neighborhoods. There are cities working to do this. South Bend, Indiana is my favorite success story here. Success story in the making, in that the snowball is rolling. South Bend has a cohort of several dozen small-scale developers. They are mostly working in low-income, formerly redlined neighborhoods. The majority are women and people of color. And collectively, they are the largest developer in the city of South Bend. In a Rust Belt city, in neighborhoods that large-scale developers using conventional Wall Street financing won't touch. They are rehabbing old houses. They are building duplexes. They are building commercial space with housing units in the back. Just amazing, amazing things. They're doing it because they have a cohort of people who can share expertise, share resources, share connections. So if you're someone interested in entrepreneurship in South Bend, you can plug in and you can learn to do this. And the city really supports that cohort. They offer technical assistance. They host monthly meetups. You easily have a line to the planning department. You have somebody who can review your pro forma, help you get it ready to take to a bank. This is the kind of work we have to do. The last thing I'll say, cities have a really important role to play in making financing available. Our system is dominated by two housing monocultures, the detached single-family home at one end and the large-scale multifamily apartment building at the other end. Almost all of the investment capital that goes into housing goes into those monocultures that can be built in really streamlined ways using streamlined loan products funded by national banks. A lot of those banks have no interest in financing sort of an oddball incremental development project, but that's where the available land is in our neighborhoods. That's where the opportunities are to thicken up these places that we've already built where there's a huge amount of demand to live. Cities can be the stopgap here. Cities can provide down payment assistance. They can provide a revolving loan fund. They can make it really, really easy for somebody who is maybe house rich but cash poor to put an accessory apartment in their backyard or carve it out of their existing house. Cities can be patient capital. They can buy down interest rates for these developers. Make a new sort of category of modern small starter housing viable. We can use the tools that we already use when we roll out the red carpet for big developers, things like tax increment financing. We can finance someone's construction of an ADU up front and have it be paid back over the years out of the property taxes on the house or out of a lien collected when that house is sold. This is a win-win. Cities get new development in places where they already have infrastructure, new revenue to support their operations. There is a lot that local government can do to be the change maker here. I'm going to skip over the rest of it, but there's a whole chapter in the book just on this. Um, will this stuff scale? A lot of people are really dismissive of small scale incremental development. The notion is a couple units here, a backyard cottage here, this will never scale. We need to stop asking, will it scale? And instead ask, will it replicate? Can we create models that people can pick up independently with the resources they have and use in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood? Thank you for your attention and indulging me as I dismally failed to deliver this talk in 30 minutes. I'm still happy to take some questions. I'm happy to hang around a few minutes over if people have an appetite for that and want to ask
Uh,
anything. Let me turn off my screen share here.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We do have some questions in the chat, so to make it faster and easier, I'm going to start reading the first one, okay? It's from Stephen Rule, and he says, okay, question. I'm curious how significantly investment REITs and Airbnbs play into the housing crisis, whether they are a significant or minor contributor.
That's a great question, and it's one that I see a lot of people talking about. My general take is that those things are largely a symptom rather than a root cause. Um, we've engineered sort of systematic housing shortages, and we've engineered a situation in which housing prices go up and up and up. Um, of course, large scale investors, private equity funds looking for a place to get a return on their money are going to find that attractive. Um, and actually, if you look at the SEC disclosures and stuff of a lot of the big investment funds that do buy up homes, they will straight up say, we look at markets where there are significant barriers to entry and low vacancy and projected, continuing low vacancy, keeping prices high. Their business model would be very quickly undermined if we did have a flood of new units coming in at lower price points. Airbnb, I lived in a place on the Gulf of Mexico that was a beach community, and there were neighborhoods where Airbnb was a huge headache and like a huge source of outrage for the existing neighbors. So I think there are places where this is a little more contextual, where like, yeah, absolutely. If that's the most lucrative use of a property, like you're going to crowd out individual home buyers who actually want to live in those homes. Um, but again, recognizing it as a symptom, I think lends itself to a broader set of solutions that maybe you do have some locally specific restrictions on short-term rentals, but you also acknowledge that like, why is this a problem? It's a problem because we have an overall shortage of housing. It's a problem maybe because we have a shortage of hotel rooms, at least in the places where tourists want to come stay. Like we can have win-wins when we have more abundance and more responsiveness in the housing market overall. Excuse me.
Thank you, Daniel. We also have another question from Kevin Hartman, and he says, how does your presentation messages differ from Chuck Maroon's?
Chuck spends a lot more time when he talks about our book talking about the financial history of the mortgage market and some of the interventions that have affected it over the years. He has more expertise than I do, frankly, in that stuff. And when we divided up the writing of the book, um, I've always wondered whether readers can tell sort of which chapters are in whose voice, but the early section, the first third of the book, which is really all about housing finance, was written by Chuck. So he places a lot more emphasis on that. And I kind of like that we have different versions because I think there are different facets of the same story that all play into the same dysfunction. I choose to talk more about zoning because that's where my interests lie and that's what I feel like ranting about.
Thank you.